Welcome to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michele Lawrence. Join me as we venture beyond the mat into the fascinating intersections of yoga and health. Each episode brings you candid conversations with the visionary leaders and practitioners who are truly shaping this field, sharing their stories, insights, and the profound impact of yoga therapy in action. Hey, it's Michele. Before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to bring up one thing. If you're enjoying This is Yoga Therapy, the best way to support the show is to like, subscribe, and review. Whether you're watching it on YouTube or listening on your commute, your engagement really helps us scale. So please take 10 seconds to hit that subscribe button or leave a review. It really makes a world of difference. Okay, let's get into today's episode. In today's episode, we are joined by Tova Olsson. Tova is a scholar of religion, an author, and a yoga teacher with over 20 years of experience. And she's that rare scholar, practitioner who can take the most of esoteric, ancient philosophical contexts and make them feel accessible, which is such a gift, and humorous, and most importantly, liberating. And whether she's lecturing in Sweden, where she lives, or running her online school, which is called Saraswati Studies, Tova's mission is to combine critical academic understanding with the dedicated heart of a long-term practitioner. She's also currently working on her PhD in religious studies at Umeå University.
Umeå.
Say that again.
Umeå.
University. Tova, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. It's really nice to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this kind invitation.
So you occupy this really unique space as a scholar practitioner. And often the academic world can feel cold or detached, while the practitioner world can sometimes lack the historical context, which we so need in ancient traditions specifically. So how has your deep academic study of religious history actually deepened or changed your personal relationship with the practice on the mat?
One of the key things that you just mentioned there is historical context.
Yeah.
Right? And when we get the historical context of some practices and we no longer fall into the trap of calling them timeless or ancient or things like this, then it kind of helps us with knowing what practices that we can let go of, what practices that we should stick with, and what kind of expectations we can actually have on the practices that we engage in, right? And so I think that I've developed a lot of discernment because of my critical academic studies. And that, of course, has been a source of doubt and disillusion sometimes, but it has never made me let go of my practice. But I think that it has definitely changed my expectations on asana, for example. Like, I think when I started practicing asana, perhaps 25 years ago or so, I really thought that this is something that would lead you towards, if not liberation, then at least goodness. And over the years, as I deepened my studies, not only into tantric and yogic philosophy, but also the history of religion, I got to learn that the goal of these practices were often quite different from what I originally thought they were. And so, yeah, I think my practice looks, well, I wouldn't say that it looks quite similar to 20 years ago, but I still have a meditation and asana practice that I do on a daily basis. And I don't know how much they would have changed if I never got into the academic studies, because I think I was always a critically minded person. That's why I started the academic studies from the beginning. And so I think I was always eager to learn, and I always had a mind that was kind of filled with doubt in a lot of ways and wanted to get to the truth of what these practices were really for and who had actually created them and in what context and for whom and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really revelatory in a way. And I really like how you said that it changed your expectations. For example, the asana practice. Why are we doing it? And what's the outcome, right? And having the context and more understanding of that seems to have really put it in a different place for you, perhaps. And like you said, maybe it doesn't change the fact that you're still doing it per se or what it looks like, but understanding the expectation of it has changed. Well, in yoga therapy and in yoga, we often use storytelling or metaphors to help clients understand their internal state. And you're known for your skillful storytelling, specifically regarding mythology. And so, how can a specific myth, perhaps one of Saraswati or a tantric deity, serve as a mirror for someone navigating a difficult life transition or, say, a period of stuckness? Tell us how you might look at myth and storytelling in that way to make it really relatable to the current condition of a human suffering.
Mm. This is how I teach mythology.
Yeah.
Always when I work with deities, or as I sometimes call them, wisdom qualities, it's really to allow people to identify with not only the different deity qualities, so to speak, that live within them, but also how these wisdom qualities become manifest in certain areas of our lives or certain periods in our life. So when you mentioned stuckness, for example, what first came to mind for me was one of the Samahavidyas, one of the 10 tantric wisdom goddesses. So these are really fierce deities. These are really fierce goddesses. And one of them that people tend to avoid is the goddess known as Dumavati, the one who is made out of smoke. Now, this goddess is known as Jishta, the eldest one, and she's often portrayed as an elderly woman, often a widow, and sometimes seated on a chariot that has been disconnected from the animals that are supposed to pull the chariot, meaning that she is a woman going nowhere. She's seated in a standstill, so to speak. And so she represents the periods in our life when we are going through what I like to call a spiritual desert. So this can be in our spiritual practice when we feel like we are just doing our practices in a mechanical way, but there's no real juice, there's no sweetness there. Perhaps devotion is lacking. But she also represents just periods in our lives, whether we have a spiritual practice or not, when we feel like we encounter loss or disappointment or disillusion. She's the one who is made out of smoke. And in Sweden, we say sometimes when we have great expectations, they go up in smoke. Like none of the things that we actually planned happened, right? And so this is the presence of Goddess Dumavati. When we learn to be taught, to have as our teacher that moment of great disappointment or loss, or maybe having parts of our identity taken away from us or changed in some manner. And so she's a wisdom quality that I love to speak about or to invoke, to be able to welcome and also learn from those difficult passages in our lives when we feel like we are no longer going anywhere or we are not wanted by anyone, or maybe as women, of course, also moving into the periods in our lives when we feel like we no longer have the looks that society expect or want from us. This is also a Dumavati passage, right? Becoming the woman who is no longer wanted for her youth or beauty or normative attractiveness.
Hmm. I could see how these myths and stories then not only become mirrors and reflections for our own life, but also a hand to hold, relating us to women of all walks and times, right? And the relatability to that. Almost like you find this within yourself and you also have a companion along the way.
Yes, and if you have a personal relationship with a deity, of course, that's what it feels like. But if you do not, you can still see that this is part of the human experience, right? Sometimes we want to be able to choose. We want to say, oh, I only want this. I only want this part of the human experience, right? But I don't want that aspect. Well, Tantric and yogic philosophy will really show us that we cannot avoid and these passages, they're part of the experience, and we might as well turn towards them and learn from them instead of trying to avoid them and then, still not being able to.
Yeah, and it seems to me in my limited awareness that the deities often represent more than one thing as well in terms of the symbolism and the way that they position themselves. It's not just one quality, right? Oftentimes it embraces and encapsulates so many different facets.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have this gift for taking complex ideas and making them really user friendly and making them relatable. And so, for a yoga therapist working with a client who might be skeptical of spirituality, for example, how do you suggest we introduce philosophical concepts like Purusha and Prakriti in a way that feels practical and grounded in their daily life? Sometimes we don't do that in a yoga therapy session, right? Because it's so driven and based on where the client is, and we always meet them where they are. But for those who may want to embrace the bigger picture, the spiritual aspects and the wisdom teachings, but might be skeptical, how do you make that relatable for them?
Mm. Well, first of all, the concept that you mentioned there, Purusha and Prakriti, these are not, so to speak, spiritual concepts, of course, depending on what kind of definition of spirituality you have, but they arise within a philosophical context, within a philosophical system or school known as Samkhya. And Samkhya is actually a philosophical school that doesn't have any theological aspect of it. Like there's no deity within the
Yeah.
Samkhya system, right? So it's quite easy to speak about these concepts as psychological concepts because they
Mm.
are, in a way, they're talking about the witness consciousness and everything that is observed by that witness consciousness, right? And then when we have, of course, tantric concepts like deities and so, we have to understand that they are still grounded in a philosophical school where everything is made out of consciousness and energy. So even looking at a symbol like the dancing form of Shiva, for example, that we see in a lot of yoga studios, where Shiva is dancing in this ring of fire. This is a teaching symbol that shows that Shiva consciousness is performing the 5 acts of consciousness, which is, bringing something into being, sustaining that form for a minute, dissolving it, hiding an aspect of consciousness, and revealing an aspect of consciousness. And so this is something that our individual minds do all the time, right? They fantasize about something, and as long as we keep a part of our attention on that fantasy or that memory or whatever it might be, we're sustaining it, right? And then it dissolves back into consciousness and something else takes its place. And while we're keeping our attention on something, then that something is revealed to us, right? It is remembered. And then when our attention moves away from it, it is forgotten or it is no longer revealed to us. Like, so this is a symbol that we might think about as a deity symbol, but it's also a symbol of the different acts of our own individual and, in a way, limited consciousness, right? And so there's many ways to talk about yoga philosophy that doesn't have to be spiritual or religious, but are really grounded in the experience of the practitioner. And so the key is, of course, knowing the philosophical systems well enough to be able to see that this is something that is verifiable. This is something that we can try and test within our own body mind experience and see, is this true? Is my consciousness performing these acts? Right? Is it so that consciousness and energy or creative capacity have an intimate relationship within my own being? Well, that is the symbol of Shiva Shakti, for example. And so knowing what you're talking about and knowing how to try this on within your own experience,
That
I
is
would
the
say.
key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so a lot of your work touches on Tantra and in a clinical setting, and maybe you can even frame that for our listeners a bit, what we're talking about here first when we talk about Tantra, because I think it is so often misunderstood. But then in a clinical setting, we're often working with people who feel at war with their bodies due to trauma or illness. And so then how does the tantric view that the body is a sacred vessel of consciousness rather than something to be transcended shift the goal of a therapy session? Could you maybe talk us through that a little bit?
Well, from what I heard from you, the first question was, what is Tantra?
Yeah.
And of this is something that we could speak about for hours and hours. And we have quite a few scholarly definitions of Tantra, but most of them are very long because people know that this is a category that is, well, even larger than the category of yoga, right? And we know that yoga is not just one thing, it's something that has developed over time and that has meant so many different things in different cultural contexts and within different historical periods. And it's the same with Tantra, of course. But when you say that Tantra is often misunderstood, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're referencing contemporary Western tantric traditions that are mostly concerned with intimacy training and sexual or
Yeah.
sensual practices. And so this is what my research is about. And I think we can come back to this later, but I would be hesitant to draw too sharp of a line between so-called, traditional or authentic or South Asian forms of Tantra and contemporary Western forms of Tantra, because I do think that they do have things in common.
Yeah.
But of course, Tantra is a lot more than only the sensual practices that are sold under the name of Tantra in North America and Europe, and also in South Asia, of course.
Yeah.
And then coming back to your second question about how Tantra can inform or help a therapeutic session, I think not only having the philosophical framework of Tantra, where you deeply honor the body as the embodiment or the manifestation of consciousness or energy, or the goddess, actually, as we would say within the tantric traditions, but really working with the body in a tantric manner. So I had some incredibly skillful asana teachers. For example, Tara Judel within Embodied Flow. And the way she taught me to work with the organs, for example, in the body, to move from the kidneys or to move from the liver or to move from the spleen, being in this very intimate relationship with your own body makes you realize not only that all of these little parts make up one whole thing, right? And that, of course, our individual form also makes up part of the whole thing, just like the cells in our body, but that everything in the body is constantly working in this manner that seems to be an act of devotion, right? Why does the heart beat and all of the cells, all of the body parts keep doing what they're doing in this great reverential act of devotion just to make this body work, what a what a blessing, what a miracle. And we don't have to be a religious or spiritual person to feel in awe when we look at the workings of the body, right? And so I think having a tantric approach is to have a very awful approach to the body and everything that happens in the body without us trying to do it. The body is just breathing and doing all of these things constantly. And so it puts me in a state of awe and devotion just thinking about the workings of the body.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I agree. So you're currently working on your PhD in religious studies, and without giving too much away about the thesis that you're working on and the research that you've been doing, how has it sparked any new insights into how the modern global yoga movement is evolving? And what's one thing you wish every yoga teacher understood about the history of the tradition?
Wow. Well, first of all, the traditions, right? So many different yoga traditions, and that we need to get away from that way of thinking that there is one thing that is the authentic thing.
Thank
And
you.
if you find that one thing, then we will be, set and
Yeah.
safe. But to be able to tolerate the fact that things are not as clear as we might have liked them to be. And as I said, the boundaries are kind of blurry between the contemporary forms of yoga and tantra and the more traditional South Asian forms. And that we have to get comfortable with the fact that things are constantly in this state of progression and transformation. Also, perhaps to get comfortable with the fact that we can't find all the answers in the past.
Yeah.
Like there are no perfect traditions, or there were no previous perfect ages where people were doing everything right and had all the
Right.
answers, right? But that we have to kind of seek the answers over and over again. Not to say that they are not practices and traditions and lineages that we can learn from. We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, obviously. There are teachers and lineages that we can learn from, but that we also have to get curious about what is happening here and now, in our communities and in our bodies, and not expect there to be any easy answers when it comes to specific lineages. There's so much to say about this, and I don't want to get into, specific details of everything that has gone wrong in all the different lineages that we're learning from. But I think that your listeners will have a lot of knowledge about this and not have any romantic ideas about some pure forms of Tantra or yoga, but that we're all constantly learning and trying to find a way to connect, right? To connect with each other, to connect with the divine, and to connect with our own bodies.
I
And
love
so
that
I would say
answer.
that, yeah, I would say that the more I dug into contemporary wisdom forms of Tantra and their history, the more I find that there's a great web of interrelations between so-called traditional forms of Tantra and more contemporary forms of Tantra. And so, yeah, of
Mhm.
course, my thesis is also very much focused on the construction of gender within contemporary tantra in Europe specifically. So I'm looking a lot at how people use terms such as masculinity, femininity, and what they place inside of these concepts, right? But that is a conversation for another
Yeah,
time.
sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so
You're so
you
welcome.
also are appreciated for your humorous approach to philosophy. And why do you say it's such an important ingredient when we're dealing with heavy topics of life and death and the soul? Does it help us bypass the ego's defenses? What is it that humor brings,
Mm.
in your opinion?
Yeah, as a teacher, I'm always a little bit careful when it comes to using a concept like the ego, because I think that a lot of spiritual teachers have used this to manipulate their students, right? Because nobody really knows what is the ego. It's
Nobody
just a
really
term that
knows.
it's a term that we throw around, and as soon as somebody is stating a boundary or feeling uncomfortable with somebody, it's so easy to say, "Oh, it's your ego," and you need to overcome that, right? But the term that is usually translated as the ego, taken from Tantric philosophy, is ahamkara. Aham meaning I am, and kara, the same verb root as kriya or karma, meaning to do something. So ahamkara is the creator of I am, or the self maker, right? The sense
Yeah.
of individual identity. And according to Tantric philosophy, this is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that you know that you are Michelle and I know that I'm Tova. It's only when we have a inflated sense of self or an inflated sense of me and mine, as the scriptures will say, that this becomes a problem, right? And so I don't think bypassing the ego is the goal, but I think humor just allows us to relax, right? It allows us to relax and not take ourselves so serious, and sometimes not to take the teacher so serious
Yeah.
either, and not place them on a pedestal, but see that
Good.
they're just a person. We're all relaxing together, and the more we can relax together, that is a, a micro form of liberation. Sometimes I think about this word moksha, liberation, and it means when you're tensing the bow, when you're ready to release the arrow, and the arrow is released, that is moksha, right? And so I think about all of the little moments when we can release, when we can release and relax. That is a micro form of moksha, right? And so humor is just the perfect gateway to that, right?
Yeah, what a really cool concept to consider,
Yeah.
right? Micro moksha and using humor for that. I love it. So I've loved this conversation. I always ask this question at the end in one form or another to each of the guests that I've had on the podcast. And it's really to understand what your personal practice is. I think when we get to share and talk and display a variety to our listeners of what practice might mean, I think it gives us the opportunity to be creative in ourselves and at the same time recognize that there's a universality to the fact that we practice, right? Whatever that might be. So I'd love to know what your practice looks like. You've got, I'm sure, a lot on your plate right now. You're a mom, you've got your work, your studies, etc. What does your own personal practice look like right now? And what is the anchor that keeps you regulated so you can continue to work and educate others?
Mm. Well, my sadhana has been extremely important for me through all of my years as a single mother. And regardless of how much work I have, I always just get up a little bit earlier so I can do my practice. So that is my anchor. But then I would say that there's a difference, of course, between, so to speak, formal practice and informal practice. Well, according to Tantra, the informal practice would be pretty much everything we do in life, like how we deal with our relationships, right? How we tolerate intimacy with reality. But then my formal practice would be I get up in the morning, I scrape my tongue, I wash my mouth, then I do puja, meaning that, I light incense and candle and I prepare my altar table, my puja table, and then I sit for meditation. And my meditation practice always begins with recitation of a series of mantras. And then I sit for meditation for about half an hour. And then I get up and I start doing what I need to do around the house. And then when my kids have gone to school, I do my asana. Well, now they're older. My kids are teenagers. I can actually start practicing while they're getting ready for school. Sometimes they sleep longer in the morning. So my meditation practice is more dependent on people still being asleep, but I can do my movement practice when people are moving around pretty much. So most days I do an asana practice or some type of movement practice. Often it's an asana practice. I also really love having dance as my spiritual movement practice. And then I will do some type of, well, obviously, I do a lot of reading within the field of religious studies, but that is more academic reading, which is also part of my Saraswati sadhana, to be honest,
Sure.
because she's a goddess that really appreciates higher studies. But I also do some kind of spiritual reading some kind of spiritual text in the day, usually. Right now, I'm also studying Hindi. Which is also kind of part of my Saraswati sadhana, to be engaged in some kind of language study, to be curious about learning something new and to keep expanding, well, the limits of the mind in a way. Yeah.
Wow. So wonderful. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today, Tuva, and I am inspired by your work and want to learn more from you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation and for being such a good conversation partner.
Thanks again for listening. If you're interested to learn more about who we are and what we do, check us out at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.